All right, I think we can get started. I think if people pop in later, they won't be too lost since conversation ends up going everywhere. Why don't we start, since there's not too many of us, maybe with a quick round of intros, just so everybody kind of knows what everybody else is interested in working on, whether generally or Interhacked or both. So yeah, just let us know who you are and what you're working on. Kristen, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm super interested in the blog club because I'm working on for Interhacked asynchronous branching conversation, like exploration with RonCAD. So it's right up our alley. Generally, I'm interested in how technology can help people connect better, and chat is definitely one of those ways. And just the pure linear view of chat or experience of chat is just not enough. I mean, I know we have to sort of keep the linearity to read things sometimes and for just easy communication, but after that, being able to play with ideas in a more experimental way, that would be really cool. So yeah.
If I call on your name and you don't want to go, just maybe send a message to links or something, or just don't say anything at all. That's fine too. Leonard, Polly, if you want to go next.
If I find a microphone, sure.
Cool.
I've been looking into exploring ways of both connecting people and what you said about async communication in different ways to join discussions in different topics together.
Les?
Sure. So we're working on, we kind of nicknamed it like the curiosity engine. Our idea is really based on like augmenting the curiosity process as opposed to just presenting information. But I actually like what you mentioned, Kristen, and I never actually thought about like the being able to play around with the chat and like structuring it in a different way, because I agree it does take a very linear process. In general, I mentioned before, I come from a data science background, but interested in kind of trying to understand how we can, I guess, augment the education or like learning process, for at the individual level.
Cheshire, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, hi.
Yep.
Sorry, are we supposed to give the intro?
Yep, if you want to. If not, totally cool. But just who you
sure.
are and what you're kind of working on.
Yeah. Oops.
Okay. Yeah, so I am currently a CS undergrad student, and like my main focus is in machine learning stuff. So yeah, that's
Cool. Shishing, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, sorry, it's Yugs. So on my end, I'm from more a virtual reality, 3D dev background, and we're working on the idea of creating an interesting in 3D space experience for conversation, where the conversation would materialize as nodes, but inside 3D space, and would slowly build up a thread that you could look back, like if you were walking and chatting with someone, looking back, you would see the whole chain thread and the potential branches that could go on. Another thing we're trying to work on also is how we could present an environment and tools in that environment that would have people change their way of approaching conversation, and in particular trying to be more conscious of what they are currently articulating at the moment in the conversation. So is it a problem, a concept, an idea, an argument? And so kind of, increasing the consciousness of the nature of what's been conversed, and also to allow people to be able to formulate better arguments on the spot, and having access to predefined structures they could then map onto their arguments. So different common argument structures and potential fallacious arguments also, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the path of conversation seems like a really interesting idea. It kind of both, in our digital mediums, we have like a very linear path, but also just my walks with people, sometimes I'll literally remember like the chain of ideas that we discussed, depending on the trail that we walked, and that's a fascinating idea. So I might be saying this wrong, but Uber, it looks like Cyrillic to me, so I'm just gonna guess here. All right, Arthur, you want to do an intro?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Arthur. I'm just a computer programmer. I don't have a lot of interest in anything particularly related to the blog club, but I just like taking in information about knowledge. So that's pretty much it for me.
I might convince Arthur to help me build something if it does get to that point. So that would be great.
If it's fun, I'll build it.
Sweet. Oh, hey. Can't hear you, so that might be yeah. That might explain things. Okay. So why don't you take a look at that? Jeremy, do you want to do a quick intro? Just tell us, what you're working on, whether outside of Interact or for Interact, or both.
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Jeremy. I'm working on a project, how to better engage with citizens through civic engagement. There's a lot of pent-up rage, we call it, with people that feel they're mistreated or not heard, and quite often this rage, like in the U.S., I reside in Germany, but in the is associated with kind of the right conservative wing movement, and we're trying to figure out why that is and how we can better engage with them before they get all crazy and take to the street, Trump parades and whatever it might not be. But I don't think it's only about the right wing. It's in general. What is the interface between political engagement and civic engagement? If you could break the two down. Thanks.
Definitely. And Ronkad, although I think that's your name is actually Conrad, right? Cool. Nice.
I joined a little late. Sorry, what's going on?
No worries. Yeah. So we're just wrapping up intros. If you want to just give us like 2 or 3 sentences about what you're working on at Interact or outside or both.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm Conrad. I'm a student at the University of Idaho. I'm working with Kristen on basically a small project to try and explore how branching conversations might function. Yeah.
Right up Blog Club's alley. It's awesome. Cool. So, yep. If anybody else wants to pop in at any point, feel free. Call if you get your microphone working. Definitely join us. Otherwise, why don't we just get started? I think as blog clubs usually go, I mean, there's very little structure. I think it's usually kind of wherever the conversation takes us, whatever we want to explore. So if anybody had any particular parts that really stood out to them, any favorite parts that made them very angry, feel free to just kick that off. Otherwise, I can definitely choose a little spot to dig into. But if anybody has something they want to kick off with, feel free.
I just want to say I've read this before, and I didn't reread it. So if anyone has like a specific part to like pull our attention to, that would be cool. Because the way it's laid out, you can kind of jump around, which is nice.
And but it's not super easy because there's no Command F. I wish there was like a very like deep hyperlink that you can link directly to, because I was trying to, I like took some notes and I lost it like completely. I was like, I don't even know where I took those notes about what. But the structure is very interesting. I think it would be hard to communicate this in like pure text. Very difficult. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel the structure of the article has this kind of loosely connected feel, and it really syncs up with what he speaks about. Like he's really saying this very strict stack of messages. It's a bit restrictive, and so in his approach to designing his article, he has kind of like the bubbles or the comic text a bit scattered, and that's something I tend to do a lot when I'm prototyping. I'm always working nowadays in whiteboard applications like Miro, and the ability to spread out the elements of a conversation, even if it's a conversation with yourselves. It really brings in something. One particular point I really resonate with, and it's right at the beginning. It's right above the picture with like a blue bubble and a red bubble. It's his sentence of as if our conversations weren't designed but transcribed. And what it makes me think about is what would it look like if people try to be much more acting as designers of their own conversation instead of just taking it as it is? What would that look like? I feel this is very interesting.
Could you kind of explain what you mean by that? Designers of your own conversation? What are you thinking?
Well, generally, like we learn to converse with people and to try to follow the flow of our thoughts, but most of the time when we're doing it, like maybe more in the casual sense, we're more acting on instinct, I would say, and whereas, for example, when you're trying to I don't know, build an argumentation or explore things, you may be more methodical and try to categorize more where you're going. I guess that this is more important in, for example, debates and that kind of stuff, where people they're actually trained to really pick up on the different components of the conversation as they go, and it's something usually you have to train for. Another example would be like I've been listening to a psychiatrist recently who's been live streaming his discussions on YouTube, and at some point he tells that the people in his field they are trained to remember precisely the flow of the conversations, so that they can then bring back the person they're conversing with to a previous point of the conversations, because often in those cases the during the conversations, the point of view or the opinions of one of the people shifts. So to be able to point out that that shift took place, for example, so that some people are trained to really have dialogues, but at the same time being very conscious of what's the structure that is building itself as it moves on.
Okay, that's cool. I wonder if that there goes your friend in the background. I wonder if to me it sounds like the difference between like improv stand-up, where people really build upon the last person's stand-up act, and and just different acts that go up there and with no real reference to the previous act. But I wonder if is that something that's learned, do you think? Is that like are we learned? Is that learned that we reflect, or people that just kind of let their minds go and don't really think about it, less reserved? It's almost like brainstorming. I think I don't know if some of you have. I'm sure some of you have been in brainstorms, and just some groups just cannot get any ideas out. And for me, it always feels like this hurdle is a feeling of, maybe this idea is not cool or dumb, or it's like asking questions in school. I think we talked about this somewhere. At some point, you feel a little bit embarrassed because when you ask a question, it shows you don't know. And maybe, I don't know where we're going with this, but I think maybe, it's almost like going back to what you were saying, obviously in the article, it's good to listen and reflect, but I think it's also human to want to interject and be kind of messy at times.
Yeah, maybe like the notion of space, like because I'm not in like this idea of like VR. It's a lot about the space you put a person in and how a person reacts to a space. Like jump from the point you just made about maybe in the class, students not daring to ask what they perceive as stupid questions. What if, as the conversation was moving on, we had a way, a visual way, for example, to kind of have an idea of what kind of place in the conversation we're in conceptually, and then what point be in a space in the conversation that would be labeled a place for asking stupid questions, for example. And so by changing like the functionality or the idea of what the space of what this space in the conversation is used for, it would provide an opening for people to, as you said, ask those questions they're not very sure about, because the participants in the conversation would have an idea at all times that this conversation can happen in a different kind of space.
I love it, actually. I think it definitely reminds me of some of the early design thinking courses I took, where they taught a lot about like the yes and methodology, about, you're always building on somebody else's work. Your few of your sentences should start with but, like you're never about to like go into somebody's idea, just shoot it down. You want to kind of build on it, reference it, reflect it, and sometimes in a group, you do feel kind of like, oh, I need to say something that actually makes sense and is coherent, and you sort of filter out the messier, the less connected thoughts that somebody out there might like be able to resonate with, but you might not want to like subject the entire like group of like 20 people to. So yes, having a little corner where you can just be like, all right, here's my messy thought, and like here's my like slightly more coherent thought, might actually, I think, get more people to share, really.
I believe that has a lot about to do with threading or branching basically. So my biggest reason why I don't want to interject in certain conversation is that I see that this is really a tiny bit of a branching out of the main flow, and I don't want to interrupt the main flow. But if I were able to just have a timeline and a recording of everything that is said, and then I can just make a note about the question that I wanted to say about that thing, and then you could maybe roll back and go back to that point later on and explore that deeper. I think something like that would help quite a lot.
Yeah. So when you facilitate, there's usually a sheet for parked ideas or parked thoughts. So you put, okay, that's an interesting thought, but we're going to park that, put that in the park place, and go on with this. But I mean, on the other hand, I think if part of it, obviously you want to stay on within the thread, but I think also those different thoughts, they allow for different thoughts in different directions. And maybe that's what you're looking for, and that's what really about creativity is. You might have a different idea than I have, and oh yeah, I was thinking about this, and then oh yeah, okay. So yeah, I think there's a time and place for that, but a lot of times it's just a question of how it's facilitated and moderated, also with conversations and debates and whatnot.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the kind of conversation you're having. So something like this, where there's no like goal other than to just be branching and like exploring, which is more like improv, Jeremy, like you brought up. What is the main conversation? Like, is that different for everybody? This is something Conrad and I have been talking about. So like different people will structure the conversation differently in their mind and see things differently. So having that kind of customization at an individual level is something that's really interesting to me. But yeah, I don't know how that would work in real life with some kind of app. Like if everyone has their own totally different way of seeing things, is it possible to have something where everyone can play with it in their own way? And there's been a lot of discussion about this, where some people see it visually, so they want to have like the path and leave notes. Other people just want something linear. Some people don't want to see any words. They just want to listen and riff real time. And then maybe later they want a transcript. So yeah.
I've definitely wondered if it'd be possible to like essentially bridge those mediums. So I could essentially reply to Slack conversations by talking, and maybe talking is my most natural form of communication. But on the other end, somebody's like replying, in threads. And if the system can be like elegant enough at translating between the two, then oh my goodness, I think I would enjoy Slack much more because the current version is awful.
Sounds amazing. I believe one of the main reasons why the branching happens in a conversation like this is that if we're two people, then branching can happen all the time. But if we're three people, then at the same time that someone else is starting to speak, someone else could have had a different thought, and then that person want to continue on what the third person was talking about, but they still want to remember their thought and be able to jump back to that later. So I believe the branching becomes exponentially more important when there are more people continuing in the discussion. And I also believe that that meetings are usually quite ineffective because there's only one person that can talk at each moment of time. But if you were able to have this sort of branching interface, you would potentially make meetings a lot more useful once again.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a very interesting, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say another thing that I usually run into, even with conversations with just two people, is that you might be trying to get feedback on something that's like a rather complex topic. And it's difficult to know whether or not the person you're talking to knows enough about that topic to be able to provide all the input you need. Like I'm very bad at math, but I'm trying to do things that rely on a lot of math. So I'm constantly going to my friends who are really good at math. And I'll try and like basically state my conclusion, but then we have to like stop that conversation and then teach me all of this content so that we could then actually continue the conversation. And then there's more branching that happens with that. So I'm trying to also come back to the, I think it was Cheshire 96. You had said something about like crafting conversations. It's definitely kind of like there's that improv element where if you're just kind of like at a party and talking, you are just kind of like trying to connect to the conversation by applying everything that you can. And branching off of that almost hurts the conversation because if you have input that isn't really important to the most important thing that was last said, then you can kind of derail everybody else. The branching conversation allows you to add more context for those who need it, and also potentially make those statements which may or may not be important, right? If you're not know what the value of your input is, then you can actually just test it by saying it. It doesn't matter if it derails the conversation. If somebody doesn't really care to read it, then they don't have to at that moment.
Yeah, it'd be cool to just layer it on, you know, somewhere in the past and not necessarily ping everybody. But if anybody does want to go back in time and like maybe expand that little bullet point, and now they see your comment too, and it's like, oh, it's like, okay, so now let me add a reply to that, and right, like, so now you're completely branched, and yet there's still a core flow that's like continuing. That'd be very cool, especially for when I got like a hilarious, you know, something to add like 20 minutes after, and I'm like, oh shit, like now I can't say it. Now you can go back and actually append it.
Right. And if you're speaking with somebody who needs that extra context, you could still continue to like work out your explanation because, you know, if you're somebody who has to talk to explain, you're also probably somebody who just has to talk in order to think. So if you're trying to talk to somebody, it's because you're trying to understand the idea yourself. So that's important. And you don't want to waste that time if the thought's in your head right now, pushing that aside so that you can relay the necessary context for that idea. You just need to get out what you've got now. And then, you know, you can hash out all the other dependent context later.
I feel there's an interesting point here that also reminds me a bit of my writing process. It's the idea to be purposefully messy in the beginning and then take the component of this mess and taking some time to order it in a way that makes the most sense and the best kind of sequence for people who would then come and have a look at it behind. The idea of allowing ourselves to purposely break at certain places the structure of the thread, maybe go more into a word cloud type of visualization because the conversation is in a messy state, and from there trying to thread a line through the right passages. And it's also about at some point trying to recognize what is, as you said, this core thread, which is the strongest thread actually. Perhaps at some point, the point where someone didn't understand something, you would have some little bubbles gravitating around that topic, just waiting for someone to revisit it and start adding maybe a new branch at that place.
No, absolutely. I like that conception of it. I think just being able to also point to a very specific section of a past conversation instead of being like, do you remember when we said, and then and then everybody's confused because nobody actually remembers the exact like phrasing, but being able to be very specific, and you know, not waste any time on basically syncing up and instead maximizing like information transfer.
Yeah, like think about how cool it would be if we could talk about this blog post by even just highlighting a rectangle and then just slapping that somewhere else. Be like, you know, just point at it, that part. Since
actually,
yeah,
that is a great point that I haven't really thought about. Like, you know, kind of like a screen share for Blog Club, but one that anybody can like take over and be like, here's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that would that would be very neat. I might have to build that for the next Interact. Let me know.
Some way it could happen would be to be able to exist as small circle avatars on the web page itself, and be able to, as a group, move from one place to another, have people teleport us from one place to another. I've seen a few prototypes. I even think maybe Alzen has created one where it's kind of like a video conferencing app, or like a Zoom-like, but instead of being like just a grid of people chatting, it's actually like on a 2D space, people as bubbles that can come closer to each other to hear each other better. So essentially, you're reproducing the phenomena of like group circles. There's an interesting thing here also, is the idea that I don't know where it's been theorized, but if you take like a group of 3, 4 and you make them speak together, everyone will still be part of the same conversation, but at some threshold, like I didn't know if it's 7 or more, but then in these moments, the conversation breaks in 2. And so you've got sub conversations that start taking place as the number of people becomes greater. So that would be another instance of where branching could be interesting as a way to retrace the step of a conversation with a higher number of people.
Yeah, you could almost like create a map of the information that you've been talking and referencing about. And, you know, you have like your little chat avatar kind of hanging around that 2D space that represents the referenced information. And then when you're actually done with that conversation, your little avatar could remain there. Maybe just like grayed out to kind of show that like you have thoughts that have been recorded that are relevant to this along with some other people, but that's not what you're talking about right now. You're like somewhere else. That would be really interesting to. Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
I think most of these ideas can also be applied to podcasts to make them much more engaging. Because usually when I listen to a podcast, I'm just not listening to a flat audio file. I'm like becoming a third like pseudo participant of a conversation from 2 sides. And I'm like, how do I like make the most of this? Sometimes I almost want to like say, no, like person A is wrong. Like I'm going to reply to person B. And it would be very interesting to be able to like send that back into the podcast and let other people then reply to me, right? As like a conversation. The question is, can you do it on a flat file, or do we actually need to structure and understand the entire conversation beneath it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, regarding that, actually, that's quite interesting because just a few weeks ago, like I think 2 or 3 weeks back, there's like in India, there's a guy who is basically, using Twitter as a podcasting medium. So what he's doing, he just, he made an announcement, made a short clip, and then he's going to publicly invite someone, a guest. Like he's not going to inform them over DM or something. So they have to publicly accept or reject the invite, and then he'll ask one question, just one question, one video, then they'll reply one answer. And obviously people can comment on each question, each answer, and those that feedback can then help in like more further questions. And that's how that podcast is going to be. I'll have to search for the profile. I'll just share the link later.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I think that is steps above any transcription currently that can be done, where you just have each node that you can like quote tweet and reply to, and like just show your sort of your likes of sections. That could be very, very interesting. Let's see. What else do we have? I think I really liked this section that I dropped down into the Google Drive document about editing and how I think it was on the web, iterative work happens through repeated presses of an edit button. But in the process, we often forget how we got there. And that manages to put it very succinctly. I think it's like this idea that's been bouncing around for a few weeks now. It's like, why do I not like edit buttons so much? Like, I like them in the sense that they allow me to make something more precise and articulate, but the original version gets overwritten. And now, if somebody comes and looks at the latest version, they're gonna be like, okay, it might look nice, but they won't know that it had changed state, and they won't necessarily know why it changed the way that it did, and whether that change was dependent on other changes. So I think this, at least I just realized that there's a very different way I message on platforms that have edit buttons and platforms that don't. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of a hybrid that maybe handles edit buttons a little more carefully and elegantly.
Yeah, I know, with Discord. Oh, actually, I don't know. There are platforms where it'll show the little edited tag, and then you can see what's changed.
Slack does, but then I don't know if they show you the revision history. I think it's just edited at time, but that's it.
But there's a difference between I'm ferociously typing out a comment and leaving typos everywhere that later when I go back and change, versus I type something, then I realize, oh, I could have written that 5 times more concisely. I should change that. That should definitely be overlaid, where it's you don't really need the other one. It's the same idea.
Yep.
It's definitely 2 different things that are really going on, though.
I'd like to propose a third, which is where somebody forgot the word "not," and they added in, and it collapses the entire conversation after that point, where it's just no, I completely understood that wrong, and then you're like, well, let me go back and re-understand everything.
That's the biggest problem with Twitter not having an edit button, right? Is somebody will say something and a whole firestorm of hell breaks loose, and then they update it. They're like, "Oh, correction, sorry about that, guys." But it doesn't matter. Nobody sees that
waving
correction.
a little flag in the wind. Nope. Yeah. No
it's oh my gosh, the root of so much misinformation, and oh god, terrible.
I definitely like the overlay though, because I never realized stacking them vertically could be a thing there, but that might be it. Like the previous version is there, but it's maybe blurry and it's sort of faded out, but you can kind of just open up the top layer and see what it used to be, and just sort of toggle between the 2 states. I like that. Anybody else have parts of the post that really stuck out to them? Made them wish that this chat app existed today?
One concept I find very strong is it's on page 2, is idea of recursive summarization, because it's something I try to practice. I started doing it a lot when I started using Roam, which has the outline with the collapsing baked in, and I find it very useful. It's like you would have a conversation, and through the different levels, if you want someone to catch up, the idea that he can be up to speed, at least on the general sense of the conversation, just by looking at the macro subjects. Because one problem we often have is we're often inundated with information. A funny thing is during the hackathon, I'm seeing all the discussions that are taking place in the different chat rooms. And some part of me knows that it would take so long to just come through everything and collect everything. So that for long conversations, them that allows to bake in a way of summarizing the whole of what has just been said. Even for people who just want to have a look back and see how they progressed, it can be a very powerful feature that we're not used to doing as things unfold.
Absolutely. Just sort of condensing, maybe 5 messages into like just 3 words. And then in the zoomed out view, you can see sort of how the conversation progressed much quicker. Maybe like a mini map almost.
Absolutely.
I keep
also
going back to
because,
that. Yeah.
Also because summarization is one of the best methods I know for actually learning a dense content that's pretty dense. It's when I was doing some studies, there was in France, so we've got like a type of prep school before engineering school, and the only exercise we had in French was doing summarizations of papers or articles, and yeah, it's a very powerful vector of learning, being able to extract the big ideas and condense them. I would say it's even more useful for the person that does it than the person who gets to read the summary afterwards.
Especially when you read like those 4-minute book summaries of like big books, and then so sometimes you're like, oh, okay, that's nice. That's a summary, and then you actually read the book and you're like, wait, they left out like 90% of the stuff, because it is extremely difficult to compress information.
Yeah,
but it's
and on
extremely
that,
valuable to do so.
And there's another thing that I've been thinking about recently pertaining to books and book summary, is that I used to think that the most important part of books was what you would find in the summary, like the core nuggets and stuff. But actually, what I've been realizing recently, I just finished a book by Scott Adams called "How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big." And Scott Adams, he's the cartoonist that does the Dilbert strips. And I realized that actually a very big component of even books that are nonfiction is, I would say, the impression that the writer through his style leaves on you. Like as you read it and the more time you spend with the book, it's kind of like the personality and the character and the content of the author leaks into you, but much less rationally, but more like the time you spend with the book leaks into you. So that could be the same with conversations, actually. Like the difference between participants who have been emotionally involved with it, who have been actors, who have been in company of the people in the conversation or in the company of a book for some time. It makes a difference, and it's something that we tend to not think about while only focusing on like the core content. Like we're still humans, like we're emotional machines, and there is this emotional component of whether it's reading a book or having a discussion with someone. This element is present. And for example, when people look at, for example, the Twitter shitstorms that can often take place, one thing we often don't, maybe we don't think about as much as we should, is that the way Twitter is structured as a conversation is that the whole emotional background of people is obfuscated. Like you don't know that at some place something was said and someone would attach a very dense emotional charge to that specific section. And we have no way of really illustrating that on Twitter in a way that allows, let's say, the catharsis of this emotion. And this is why the negativity takes over. And like you only have a thumbs down. It's not, you can't be nuanced in your expression of the emotion. And that's also when, because the tools are extremely simple, people then pile on and you get those mob effects. So like another thing I'm interested in exploring, and maybe we'll add it to like the thing we're working on, is as the conversation takes place, and if you're in a 3D space when you have access to shapes, colors, images, and like non-textual ways of expressing things, could you pin to certain points things representing your own internal states, the emotions you're going through? And this would also mean when you come back to the conversation, you could see the points in the conversation where you felt the most inspired or the most perplexed. And these would be the places looking back that you would really want to return to when you think about it.
I think that's really important Because I think it's easy to just kind of imagine that people would be really structured and be like, I disagree. I contend to this idea, and here are the 5 reasons why. But we are very emotional creatures. If we find something that hurts us, we don't immediately think of, oh, I certainly contend to this idea. I know my 5 reasons why. It just kind of like it hits you in the stomach, and you might not necessarily know why at first. I think even if those like if that information you want to attach isn't public, I think it would be really valuable to be able to tag an idea as confusing just for you to see. And then maybe optionally, you could tell other people that you're confused by it, and maybe they can help. But I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, it has been like one of the biggest like changes of opinion for me in this past year or a few is recognizing that I really believe that people are more emotional fundamentally than they are rational. And this is very hard for like I consider myself much more like rational. I think a lot, I dialogue with myself, but I've been realizing that actually the majority, whether and often they aren't conscious of it, and that's the idea of consciousness. Where is the consciousness at? But people don't realize that they're mostly driven by emotion, and it's often an unconscious process. We people imagining that the content of the conversation is rational, they're actually completely oblivious to the whole undertones that are emotional and that influence us even when we're not looking. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that the emotional sort of like landscape to reflect on later would probably be extremely helpful for personal insight and personal growth. And so there's like a meta thing going on here where you're learning through the text or whatever it is, not only about whatever content that whoever created it was trying to get across, but you're also learning about yourself. So there's a relationship there. And you can talk about both aspects of it. Some of it's more personal, but yeah, there's like a couple things going on. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think looking back at past conversations I've had on Facebook before I deleted my Facebook, if I could at least just mark certain things as like, oh, this made me incredibly angry, then I could just move on. I wouldn't have to type anything. I could like wait a little bit and know that like if I really want to respond to Grandpa because he posted that god awful thing, yeah, now I can. I could go back when I'm feeling a little cooler and
a cooldown timer.
Exactly. And then I know not everybody has to know that I'm just really upset, and there's not like a little stupid angry face underneath the post that has no context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On a slightly related note, I think emojis get us pretty far, like in terms of adding context to, or not even emojis, I mean, just ASCII, like smiley faces and whatnot to text. But I do wish, and iMessage, for those of you that have used it, like lets you now send a message with effects. So sometimes it could kind of like fade in or just like slam in. But I kind of want that everywhere. Like I want, a way to add spatial or like some sort of nuance to a message to where I could kind of like gently propose an idea as opposed to being like, no, you're wrong. Like here it is, because like the text probably looks exactly the same, but I'm wondering if how the message is delivered into the screen might like put the other person at ease, and they're being like, no, I'm like not attacking your idea. It's just like here's a little suggestion. I think that would help online communication.
Definitely, because the alternative is to explain that intention in text, and that just I haven't found a good way to do that. Like, hey, I have this idea. I don't know how I think about it, so I'm only suggesting this.
There's all this like, let me set the context for what I'm about to say, and then it's just like, just say the thing, and then but if you just say the thing, then people are reacting to it, and you're like, oh, this is not what I wanted to happen. Yep.
Yeah.
Almost need to build out a library of other tweets and stuff where it explains that context, so you could just slap the link in and then talk about it.
Yep. I've been wanting to write like maybe a little communication policy page on my site that's just like like just lays the groundwork for that. It basically just says, listen, like if you get a message from me and it sounds snarky, it probably wasn't. I'm just really bad at writing. I promise. That basically could be like summarize the entire thing. Like,
I think we've maybe talked about this before, John, but I've seen people who do a lot of email correspondence have on their website here, like, here's how I use email. Here's like kind of the tone that often comes through, and some people get upset by it, but just so you know, this is like how I operate, which is really interesting. It's sort of like emotionally intelligent, like business people that I've seen doing this, which is kind of cool because it communicates something beyond just the message. Again, it's the emotional layer.
Yep. And just removes ambiguity, which always helps any sort of conversation, communication.
Yeah, especially text. Like you can read things in so many different ways. Emotion is sometimes hard to convey.
Fair, yeah.
Yeah, we got all those signals that when we're speaking face to face, we're always picking up on facial cues, voice tones, and you can kind of see the effects of mainly text-based conversation taking place on the internet. Like you would ask yourself the question, would you still have those kind of mob mentalities or piling on if people were forced to address the person face to face? My feeling, it wouldn't be the case, because being face to face, you have to take ownership in your head of the fact that it's a human in front of you. And I find it interesting of how could we have ways for text to allow those like social, physical, visual cues that are actually an integral part of our way of understanding each other to pass through. And I'm not sure, like, if like text is like if you take only the rational parts, but our brain is trying to fill in the emotional nature. Hence, you can have those misunderstanding, like you were alluding to with the person describing how she responds in email. She has to lay out the kind of associated tone that people would be expecting with her email, because she can't do it with her voice nor her expressions.
What I just recalled. So where do I start? So there are like 2D video games and stuff like that where basically the entire thing is text based. Even stuff like Undertale, it's like, or Undertale would be a better example. Legend of Zelda, not so much, because it's still all text. But early video games that only rely on that text have the same problem as like the emotion can't be conveyed. Video games solve that problem by putting the little avatar of the character there and then showing the emotion on the character's face by having the text. What if we just need a Twitter that has like my little head cropped out that conveys the emotion on my face and the text next to it? You have like a little happy Conrad, angry Conrad, really confused Conrad. Be really cheap, but I mean that's the solution that video game designers have approached, at least.
Kind of like Clippy.
Yeah.
It gets more interesting, actually. Like that's in the first few years, that's definitely how it was, just a face with an emotion. Obviously very pixelated at the start, but now, especially for Undertale, it's actually taken further. There's like the way that the text is brought in, the speed that the letters appear with, the sound that the letters appear with, the font, the color of it. All these things are all used to elicit, style or emotion or character. You can take it very far.
Do you think, though, the thing with books, because obviously text is old and abstract, and that's like if you think about the Bible, there's different ways you can interpret the Bible, and people do it. There's so many isms with the Bible and other texts. But the argument for a lot of older, I guess, traditionalists are, if everything is written out, or if everything is given, then the mind doesn't have the chance to wander and come up with its own ideas. So it's like watching, if you watch Harry Potter, the movie, before you read it, you already have that picture of who Hermione or Harry Potter is before you read it. So I don't. There's obviously when we think about making everything so explicit, you also have to think about what then the potential negative effects of that could be. But also, I mean, like I said with the Bible, there's also, if it's not explicit, then people are going to interpret it the way they want to. So I don't know if there's, I don't know if there's like, obviously there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but I think we're in this like the middle space where we don't know what's best.
Yeah, you definitely have to decide if the text that you want to, or the information that you just want to get out, is it allowable for that misinformation to be interpreted in a way other than what you're trying to describe? Because I think for a lot of mediums, it's definitely, there's value to that. A lot less value if you're trying to convince people, how to function under a pandemic, for instance. That's something that you really want to be explicit about.
I mean, I think part of the beauty of language is that it still does allow for both. I mean, obviously spoken language over written, but even written, I think sometimes I send somebody a message that's like maybe 3 words and there's no punctuation, no grammar, and yet it'll deliver like the idea perfectly. It doesn't need that extra, layering of specificity or context. But then if somebody else saw it, they'd be like, what does this even mean? Or downright like you were like mean when you said this, even though like that wasn't the intention. So I think, yeah, if a message can be written, it can be misinterpreted basically. And yeah, we have to like be very careful about where we do leave ambiguity and try to imagine how it can be misconstrued and where it can go.
Maybe one future possibility to build on that idea, if we want to keep the text medium but still be able to communicate how we're feeling, we're seeing a lot of innovation taking place with like the brain technology, be it Neuralink or maybe like non attached devices. Imagining if you can have like a text messenger app, but where the participants would have to have some device that is able to register stress levels or other kind of states you can infer from brain readings, and this would be added to the text, maybe in form of a color or shakiness or something, and so you would know like when the person is responding, is he feeling calm, is he feeling stressed, or maybe that will be an interesting design exploration that will be allowed by like those coming technologies.
Also interesting because who designs those algorithms? Who designs if this is a, is this anger? Is this a happiness? And that's what's happening now, though. If you look at AI and the machines are making these decisions, which are authored by a very small group of white male engineers, one could say, then obviously that's why there's a misrepresentation of diversity within tech in general. And then when tech becomes so embedded in everything we do, then that just raises to the top as well. If you look at GPT-3, that the new AI thing, people are all excited about it, but all it does is read the internet, and the internet is a lot of it's garbage. So it's like garbage in, garbage out. So I think there's a lot you can do with it, but I think if you get back to like the original premise of face-to-face communication, you have that context which you were talking about, and also there's we can interpret one another still quite well as humans, whereas there's no mediator, a mediator being the algorithm, which is decided upon by people like Zuckerberg and stuff, for better or for worse.
Yeah, well, maybe the individuals could train their own algorithms. Like there's this app I use where like it takes your pulse near the finger and tries to extrapolate how like the different kinds of tired you are, because depending on like your parasympathetic nervous system or whatever, it can inform you if you're the real kind of tired or the tired generated from stress and that sort of thing. But the main premise of the application is that the more the user uses it, the more it learns the patterns that are more specific to the users. So maybe in a similar way, you could train an AI to recognize, well, at that point I was feeling so, and so it registers the pattern. So I don't know. And may be interesting, like how, like we know that in real life we differentiate a lot between each other, like visually, like the idea behind racism is because we see things visually. But if we were to just analyze like the brain patterns of people, what, I'm not sure what kind of differences would emerge, but because in a sense we all kind of feel the same emotions. My guess it would change maybe culturally. That's where like studies like, for example, what Paul Ekman, the kind of emotion expert, did. He was able to categorize the 6 emotions that you find cross-culturally because they're associated with the same facial expressions, for example. So we do, I think, have a space for commonalities pertaining to the states we can feel in our lives. The interesting thing with language would be how between different language we may have different ways of expressing more intricate emotions. There was a great project I found. I'm going to try to find the link to drop it in the links channel, but essentially it's a graph that depicts, for example, Chinese word that talk about an emotion that we don't have the equivalent for in the English language.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things to talk with somebody where both of you know the same 2 languages, and you get to autocomplete or sort of like backfill. Not even sure what the word here is, but use the scope of both languages to actually express the exact idea. If perhaps we can do that through something resembling like a neural interface, then that becomes very interesting. It's like I could just like try to picture the exact like thing I'm talking about and hopefully convey it without even having to choose a word out of a corpus that hopefully both of us know.
But the other thing about language is it's not just about communication, it's about culture. And I think even the styles of communication. So I grew up in the US, but the style, I live in Germany, and you were talking about emails, and sometimes I would read an email from German. It's like, geez, they don't fuck around, it's pretty blunt. Whereas, the Americans are kind of, oh yeah, let's hang out sometime. You might never hear from them again. So there's so many different ways to interpret that. So I think 100% Neuralink, interesting concept, but how do you load that also with cultural context? Because language is really about understanding culture as well. So that's why I think over here when I learned German, it's not me just wanting to communicate, but also understand the nuance and the culture. And Germany has so many strange words, but a word to describe everything, right? Or if you think about the culturally in Japan, they're known to be a little more reserved, and obviously probably a little more hierarchical in their culture. So language it's definitely super interesting as far as exploring different contexts for that language. And that's why I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI in language, but it really is missing that diversity across the board. That's what's a little scary, actually, is how much of these platforms, because I used to work at Google as well, how many of these platforms are just so embedded in our lives, but they're really just authored by a very small sliver of people with a very, very small, narrow perspective.
Also because those platforms, they are designed to create engagement and not necessarily understanding or even personal development or self-betterment. That's something to keep in mind, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between like a Telegram versus WhatsApp now. It's an ad platform. I think a lot of people, like our parents, or maybe not our parents, but people forget that, oh yeah, cool. Like when Google came out with, you can upload as many free photos that you want to. I was just like, wow, that's more data for their AI machine. So yeah, definitely. I think in every interface or app or platform we use, you always have to try to figure out what is their angle, And if you have to pay for it, that's the age-old surveillance capitalism thing. If you have to pay for it, then it's probably not too bad. But if it's free, then you're probably the product.
Attention to, for sure. Well, we're running right up about an hour right now, which I think usually is like where we tend to wrap things up. If somebody has a specific thing they want to bring up, like a concluding parting thoughts, definitely now's the time. But I'm really grateful for all of you to show up. It's been great.
About the previous interface that people were talking about, I tried to sketch something. Can I show it?
Yes, please. We'd love to. Is like a screen share, or do you want to post it in links? Either would work.
I believe I would like to try to, if I manage to do this correctly.
Yep, we can see it.
Visible?
Yep.
Yeah. So you were talking previously about having some sort of conversation, being able to track the different branches of the conversation, and then having different convos join in together, and also having different conversations to split. So one way I was thinking about potentially visualizing this was if you have different people, they join in, you get their avatars, and then you see their voice lines. So directly when someone is speaking, you will be able to see it as the waveform. I don't know if it's visible down here.
So you could very clearly see who was talking at what point. Maybe there'd be like different colors. You can kind of see if they were talking at the same time or one after another, and like kind of switching off just visually very clearly. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, like the subway map almost.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then really cool. At any point of time, the purple person could add a note that is timestamped. So then later on in the conversation, they could join back in that thought when there is a moment of pause, and you could go back to the different thoughts that were branching out later.
Yep.
Also, in the same way, you could have sideline conversations that are not just voice, but are potential text and links and images. And then you could have a different conversation around here with two completely different people that are doing this text kind of thing. And I also was quite inspired by where they showed that you were able to do the outlining thing, but with text chat. So if you have a text conversation, you could also indent it if there's like a subtopic going on there. And then maybe put that and join that back into this other conversation and have those other two people maybe join back into this main chat. So in that sort of sense, you will always be able to get an overview of the whole conversation from a timeline perspective, but you will also be able to add different thoughts, different potential mergings and splittings on the side, and also merge different formats from text, passive text, and then active voice conversation.
I think that's a really important thing there. Like you're not just limiting it to transcription only or voice only. It like manages to sort of combine both in a pretty presentable way. This is really cool. Thanks for sharing.
Any ideas of where it would break and how it could be made better?
Definitely take a photo and then post it after. Just so we.
I was just gonna say that.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. All right. Any other last thoughts? Meta thoughts? Meta thoughts? All of them go. They're all good.
I was going to say something earlier, and I think it maybe sums things up, but when there's ambiguity or misunderstanding or like differences of perspective, that gives people the room or the space to enter into dialogue in whatever way, shape, or form that is in order to find commonality to better understand what's going on. So there's always, I don't know, I always see it as an opportunity, even though there's sometimes when things get heated, but that's sort of what we're kind of hinting at, that there's always some way of connecting, a way of understanding. And it's not that you have to completely agree, but there is some agreement of understanding. You see things that way, and I see things this way, and that's somehow connected. There's just something cool about forming connections, even when there's ambiguity or difference.
Yeah, well put. I mean, it'd be hard to like just say that's it. I'm going to say this 100% accurately. Nobody will disagree because then, well, it's impossible. And yeah, it's like it's in the cracks in between where we actually like figure out what's what.
Yep.
I love that.
Yeah, I think it's really about are you gonna conceive the conversation as a game where there's gonna be winners and losers, or are you gonna conceive the conversation as something that is gonna be built by multiple people, and that's gonna be a space of collaboration, and you can see quite easily on like Twitter threads and the sort. You can often pick up which kind of frame of mind the participants may have in the way they are reacting. Like the easiest way, like, is the comment constructive or not? But it's really about how do you bring the people, or do you present the conversation that's going to take place or that is taking place in a way that that make people associate it more with an interesting space for collaboration and nuance versus a social game that we're maybe too much used to having.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we can conclude. Thanks again for everybody for joining. I think had a great time. And I think we're going to try to resume Blog Club, like the actual Blog Club that was started by Gleb, at some point in the near future. So keep an eye on that. But yeah, thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of the Interhact.